Hi, dyslexic dad here. I want to do a video on something that I've noticed with both of the narcissists that I've experienced in my life, and I just call it the therapy game. Um, I don't know to what extent other people have experienced this same thing with their narcissists in their lives, but I have a feeling that even if they haven't, that a lot of the themes, manipulation, etc., will resonate, with people that have experienced that or people that are going through similar things currently. So, a trick, out of the old narcissist toolbox that I've seen is having to do with therapy. So, for instance, as things would go bad or started to go bad in my marriage, we would have discussions and stuff, and they really weren't fruitful. Surprise, surprise. And the narcissist, my wife at the time, said, "Would you be open to going to couples counseling, to therapy?" And I thought, sure, nothing to lose, and I was actually hopeful because I was thinking, okay, speaking one on one has not been productive. It has been time consuming. In some ways, I feel like it's actually caused more conflict because we were just going around, in circles. And so going to an environment where there was a neutral third party, the therapist, that would give, one, a fresh perspective, and two, they would have the training, the expertise, the experience to address the problem and hopefully solve it. So I was very hopeful. I was, very gung ho, and so we would go to the couples counseling, and we would talk about our problems and share our different perspectives on the problem. So we wanted to agree, okay, this is the problem, this is my perspective on the problem, and this is my perspective on the problem. And then we would discuss that so that the therapist could get an idea of kind of what was objectively happening. What's the reality that's common to both parties, and we'll address that. And so we did that. And if you've been through any type of therapy, the first couple of sessions, in my opinion, aren't very productive at all, just by their nature. At that point, you're one, getting, building some rapport with the therapist, and two, you're giving the whole backstory about how the two of you met, where you're at, your values, and then, your partner does the same. And so the first couple of sessions, you just do a lot of talking, and then the time's up and you leave. But after, say, the third or fourth session, at that point, the therapist should be right there doing the work with you and saying, okay, what about this? And asking deep probing questions and determining, okay, is this an issue with you? Is this an issue with you? Or is this a relationship issue? And so, me and my wife at the time, we went through that, we did that, and after a while, the therapist realized what the situation was that was the problem, and so the therapist proposed a solution and said, okay, how about the two of you do XYZ, and that way you'll be happy, that way you'll be happy, you'll both be happy, and we can see how that works, and if we need to fine tune it, and the therapist would look at me and say, okay, how does that sound to you? And I'd say, sounds great. I would love to have the problem solved. And the therapist would turn to my wife and say, how does that sound to you? And my wife would nod her head and say, yes, that sounds good to me. And my therapist would say, okay, okay, is this something you can do? I'd say yes, and then turn to my wife, is this something you can do? And again, the strong head nodding, yes, that is definitely something, that is something that I can do. I can follow, that plan. We're both on board. We're both on the same page. And say that, in the room to the therapist and to me. And so I'm thinking, wow, I've got really good, I've got hope. I've got hope. So I'm thinking, great. And so we leave the session. We were at that time, I think it was, weekly sessions, because it was, pretty intense. We go home, and my wife's behavior doesn't change at all. Nothing. It was confusing. It was as if we never even went to therapy, or that her mind was erased as soon as she left, the office. Nothing. No change at all. And so, a week later, we go back to counseling, and the therapist was like, hey, hey guys, how's it going? How did the week go? And, my ex-wife would just be like, okay. And I would be like, just dumbfounded. And I would say, no, nothing changed. Like, I was all on board with the plan, let's do XYZ. And she didn't do anything. And so the therapist would turn to her and say, is this true? And, she might mumble or begrudgingly say, well, it was a hard week. Just something vague and dismissive like that. Or, I just need time. Again, just these very short, vague, dismissive answers that don't actually mean anything. And we talk some more, and then basically the therapist would throw the solution out again and say, okay, can we both agree that XYZ is a good solution to the issue? It's a win-win, and we should try that. And my wife would be nodding her head and say, yeah, XYZ is a great solution. I really like that solution. Yeah. And the therapist will say, okay, so is this something that you're going to be able to do this week and, really put into action? And, I would say yes. And my, ex-wife would just nod her head and say, yeah, definitely. XYZ on board, definitely ready to put it into action this week. Yeah. This is going to be a good week. And so I'm guys, scratching my head being like, well, I don't know. I'm still hopeful. You don't know if you don't know. So, cross my fingers and hope for the best. Yeah. And so we left, go home. Nothing. Not a damn change at all. Absolutely nothing. And again, like at this point, this is after the second session that the therapist has said this, and she's agreed. I'm in shock. I am just total, confusion. I don't know if one of the purposes of the narcissist doing this is to cause that cognitive dissonance that narcissists are so good at, where the narcissist will say one thing and their actions will be at a 90-degree angle to that, just complete opposite direction, which is very confusing when you're used to people's words and actions aligning. And so just, very confusing. I think we went back a third time, fourth time, but by the third or fourth time I was just pretty disgusted. I don't know to what extent I was even trying to hide it at that time. I was just showing up, and and the therapist would be like, hey, just want to check in, blah blah. And I'm like, no, nothing's changing. This doesn't work if only one person is ready to do XYZ. And of course, then like the vague statements would come where she would be dismissive and be like, well, you tried doing all these things when you have to cook dinner, or when you have a hard day at work, or whatever. I mean, just in typical narcissist fashion, they have an excuse for everything. So that was with my ex-wife, and basically the marriage imploded before things got too much further than that. I was just so utterly disgusted. In that situation, I had just given up on therapy, changing her behavior, on her changing her behavior, on just anything changing at that point. I had just been so disgusted with her at that point that I just let the marriage implode. So that was with my my ex-wife. My ex-girlfriend, it's insane. It really is. So with my ex-wife, going back a little bit, I think over the course of the ending, we saw two separate therapists. And, or actually, well, we started with three, but that, way back. So going to my ex-girlfriend, again, they all read from the same playbook. Similar situation. Things are going south to the point where I'm starting to eye the exit and just thinking like, okay, this is bad. Do I need to just get up and walk out? And I think that, narcissist at a certain time in the relationship, they sense that, but they still, they want you to stay. And so, again, she was like, oh, couples therapy. Let's do couples therapy. And I'm like, okay. And so, carbon copy. So we go to couples therapy. We would talk, and the therapist would say, okay, hey, how about we try XYZ? How does that sound to you? And I'd say, no, okay, that sounds great. How does it sound to you? And my ex-girlfriend would say, nod her head, yeah, sounds good. And then the therapist would say, okay, so are you two gonna, put that plan in action? And, I would say yes, and my ex-girlfriend would nod her head, say yes, we will definitely do this. We're gonna stick to the plan. We're gonna work on, doing XYZ. And so I'm thinking, great. And then we leave and nothing changes. And at one point in the relationship, and oddly, embarrassingly enough, this was fairly early in the relationship. There was a situation where this had come up, and she, in both cases, the narcissist was the one that recommended we go to therapy. I had a situation where we actually went 8 weeks with going to therapy, agreeing to do XYZ, and then being like, oh, oh my God, I can't, my meds, I'm out on my meds, or, oh my gosh, I've had such a hard day at work, and, oh my God, I'm just exhausted. I think I have that disease that just makes you tired, and you can't get up off the couch for a week. I think I've got that, just every excuse in the book. And and so that just kind of crashed and burned. And then we went on, and then 2 times later, again, things got bad enough to where I was, eyeing the exit, and she, said, "Hey, let's try therapy." I'm like, "Okay." And again, like at that point, I was just very deep in the narcissistic fog, and I couldn't make heads or tails out of what was happening to me in or the relationship or anything. And so I had a situation where, with my ex-girlfriend, over the full course, I think we saw 3 separate therapists, all 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 initiated by my ex-girlfriend, the narcissist, to go to the therapist to help resolve our issues. And again, the therapist would say, "Okay, let's do this." And my ex-girlfriend would nod and be like, "Yep, yep, both on board, both on board." And then, like, as soon as we would leave the building, it's like mind erase, mind erase, mind erase, just gone. And so it's what I've termed the therapy game, where I'm actually a firm believer in therapy for individuals and for couples. I think that when you have 2 people that want to make things work and are willing to do the work, that therapy can really help out in those situations. But what happens, at least in my experience, is that you will have the narcissist view therapy as another tool in their toolbox. And so when the narcissist, basically has their victim, and their victim's eyeing the exit door, being like, "Okay, this is bad. Should I leave?" The narcissist can go, "Okay, hey, how about we go to therapy? I understand you're not happy with the way things are in the relationship. Let's go to therapy and fix this." And and normally you would think, "Oh yeah, that sounds great." But the whole time the narcissist is saying this, they don't have any intention of doing a damn thing that comes out of therapy. And honestly, it doesn't matter the reasoning that the narcissists have. I don't know if it's something where they don't believe anything's wrong with them, therefore the therapist will say the problem is the victim and point to them. Or what I think is actually the case is that the narcissist simply does not care, that it's just simply a stalling tactic, and also a manipulative one, where the therapist or the narcissist can say, "Look, I care about this relationship. That's why I recommended we go to therapy. If I didn't want this relationship to work out, would I want us to go to therapy for 8 weeks in a row? I do that because I care." And it's just like, no, you're a monster, and you're just lying and manipulating me. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. It's another one of those just inhuman, horrible, devious, manipulative things that narcissists do, is saying, "Let's go to couples therapy," when they have zero intention of changing themselves or changing anything that they do within the relationship. So hopefully this has been helpful.